Yes. Please use your microphones to speak so we can all hear you. Again, welcome. This is the subcommittee work session on HB 1644 FN, and it's relative to the placement of telecommunication antenna and establishing a registry for residents who are experiencing biological symptoms from wireless radiation exposure. I will say that we've had a couple of meetings before, and the present bill, as it was introduced, is not going to happen. But the purpose of this subcommittee is to determine, very simply, do we oh, thank you. The purpose of this subcommittee meeting here is to determine whether or not we will recommend to the full committee if there should be further legislative action to be done. That does not necessarily mean that it would say that we recommend passage of the current bill. It does not necessarily mean that we would be recommending a specific bill to be put into the current system. It merely says that we feel some type of legislative action of some general subject is recommended to be put forth at some time in the future. It would be up to the full committee to decide how they want to vote on that recommendation. Or the subcommittee could recommend that we don't feel there is a need for further legislative action, and we could proceed with that recommendation to the full committee as well. With that being said, I'd like to introduce the subcommittee members that are here present today. Is Representative Nodder, Representative Partial, Representative Kelly Pitts, myself, and Representative White is on the subcommittee, but he's not present here today. These are the members that would be voting on our recommendation today. Those are the only people that are assigned to the subcommittee as voting members. With that being said, I've had a request from Representative Abrami to make a few-minute statement, so turn it over to Representative Abrami.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I appreciate being a non-voting member on this panel. I appreciate that. And appreciate that you allowed us to do, not Zoom, but what are we doing? Teams, to bring in some other additional voices that we didn't hear from in the prior meetings that we've had on this. And obviously my goal is to keep this alive, not necessarily in the form that it was. The bill, I'm agreeing. I understand that bill is gone, the 1644, but to keep the whole concept and the discussion of not necessarily 5G, but RF radiation is what we're talking about here. So with that, we have three new voices. Theodora Scarrato, who'll talk to us about what municipalities are doing, and it's the first handout that you see, the glossy one that she'll be speaking from, and then what's going on in municipalities and what's going on with other research. Susan Foster, I don't know if she's on yet, who was involved with the California firefighters years ago, and she'll explain what happened there, and Scott McAuliffe, who's an attorney who has been looking at these issues for many years. And then we'll wrap up with Cece Doucette, who you've heard from before, but who's going to talk about our education, because I think the chair asked me last week, well, what kind of legislation would you be thinking about? And Representative Callie Pitts had already suggested maybe legislation related to RF education, which we certainly will probably try to file a bill there. But the other is how do we empower our municipalities to have some additional say in the whole issue of placement of towers in their communities? So they're trying to make it more of a local thing, and so those are the two areas that we're thinking now of legislation for next year that would come under the heading of basically RF radiation. So with that, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Representative Abrami. I would like to add that in addition, Representative Lewicki is here, and he's going to offer a few words on his ideas involving frequency that he feels hasn't been spoken about enough, and at some point in time, we'll introduce him to have a say on that. If there's anybody else here who came here to prepare something of a brief statement, I would need to have their names brought up here so I can call on them. If not, we would just proceed with the discussion. And my aim is to be out of here before 12 noon or sooner. So, you have your. Okay, thank you. I will try to alternate if I can. I understand we are on a telecast here called Teams. Is that correct?
I'll prepare this. I am EHS, so it's hard for me to be in this room, but I did prepare my testimony just in case.
Okay, and you plan to speak to it?
I hope to.
Okay, all right,
Yeah, I'm a little sensitive in this room. So.
okay. With that said, how do we,
Theodore, no, we have people who will, let's call the witness.
Okay.
They'll show the right person.
okay, so we'll start with the first person that is broadcasting from afar, which is Theodora Scirato. You're on.
Thank you so much, subcommittee, for the opportunity. Honored, and I'd be glad to answer questions at the end. I did send a packet with information. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So I'm Executive Director of Environmental Health Trust, and we're a scientific think tank focused on publishing research, raising awareness on science-based measures to prevent cancer and other disease, focusing on environmental health issues. I know that you're familiar by now with our lawsuit against the FCC, where we challenged their decision not to update the FCC's 1996 limits for human exposure to radio frequency radiation. So in 2021, when the FCC was deemed by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit as having been arbitrary and capricious in its refusal to update the U.S. FCC limits, which were set in 1996, the court found that the FCC had ignored record evidence, including the impacts of long-term wireless exposure, because there has been no report by any federal agency reviewing the impact of long-term exposure, especially to children and in the new 5G environment. The testimony of people injured by wireless radiation, impacts to the environment, and non-cancer impacts the developing brain and reproduction. Now, the FCC was mandated to establish reasonable record of review of the evidence and to address issues that it had ignored, like children, long-term exposure, and so forth. But so far, the FCC has not responded. So in my packet, and I can send you a online one that has links to everything that is listed in there, we address how the FCC limits and the case of cell tower radiation really exemplifies the concept of a regulatory gap. There was no pre-market safety testing for long-term damages from non-ionizing radiation exposure by any federal agency, certainly not on up-to-date science. There is no post-market surveillance for health effects. There's been no risk analysis for long-term effects, yet there's an ever-accumulating body of independent science showing harmful effects. Biological effects, adverse biological effects at levels that are in FCC limits. I also have in the packet page on various setbacks of different municipalities around the country that you have in front of you, like Shelburne, Massachusetts, 3,000 feet for schools and 1,500 for homes. Copake, New York, 1,500 feet, homes, schools, churches, and public buildings, and so forth. But what I really wanted to address was some of the information that's been presented that makes it seem like our federal agencies have in fact opined or had an opinion about whether radio frequency radiation is safe or not. First of all, the FDA has no authority in regards to cell tower radiation and has not reviewed the totality of evidence, at least in any public way that we're aware. And just, I have a quote in the packet where a mother wrote to the FDA, and actually we have several responses from the FDA at this point, and she requested safety data on the small cell that was right in front of her. And the director of the FDA Office of Policy Center for Devices and Radiological Health responded, the FDA does not regulate cell towers or cell tower radiation. Therefore, the FDA has no studies or information on cell towers to provide in response to your questions. There's a Pittsburgh Law Review article entitled Why Radiofrequency Radiation Standards Have Failed to Keep Up with Technology that concludes the FCC and FDA have failed in their obligation to prescribe safe radiofrequency radiation guidelines produced from wireless communication devices to protect the public health and safety. So what about the CDC? Well, there are no scientific reviews by the CDC on wireless radiation that evaluated the science in any systematic way, or in any way, actually, that we're aware of. In fact, our investigations found that the CDC hired a consultant with longstanding wireless industry ties to serve subject matter expert on their pages on non-ionizing radiation and wireless wearables. And we have all of that on our website, and I also link to that. The National Cancer Institute. There are no scientific research reports by the National Cancer Institute that exist regarding 5G cell tower or even cell phone safety. And I myself contacted the National Cancer Institute in 2016 because I had been told by my municipality that the NCI somehow supported the limits or had reviewed this issue. And they responded back to me that their literature review, neither the literature reviews nor the fact sheet make safety determinations. And of course, the New Hampshire 5G Commission Commissioner Denise Ricciardi got a response back from the National Cancer Institute most recently, and I'll quote, the NCI is not involved in the regulation of radio frequency communications infrastructure devices, nor do we make recommendations, policies related to this technology. Now, the American Cancer Society also has cited as somehow supporting FCC limits or saying that all, providing safety assurances. But this is not true. The American Cancer Society states very clearly that they don't have an official position or statement on whether or not radiofrequency radiation from cell phone, cell towers, or other sources is a cause of cancer, and that's on their website. And they have not done any kind of review related to wireless radiofrequency radiation. The backstory that after World War II, the U.S. had developed a rather robust research program involving several U.S. agencies. In 1984, the Environmental Protection Agency released a report on the biological effects of electromagnetic fields. And actually, in the early 90s, the EPA was the recommended agency to develop human exposure limits. However, at the mid-90s was also when there was heavy lobbying for the Telecom Act. In fact, it was the most heavily lobbied bill at that time ever. And by the time it passed in 1996, the Environmental Protection Agency had been fully defunded from their work on electromagnetic fields. And that was a few months after actually they had presented to the FCC how they were developing safety limits that would be based on heating effect, as well as non-thermal, non-heating biological effects. But they were fully defunded from developing safety limits. In fact, we don't have federally developed safety limits. Those are adopted limits by the FCC. So in 2020, I wrote the Environmental Protection Agency about their opinion, and they responded. EPA's last review was in the 1984 document, which I referred to, the biological effects of radiofrequency radiation. And they also said that the EPA does not currently have a funded mandate for radiofrequency radiation manners. And what about the World Health Organization? That's also been quoted as somehow providing safety assurances. There is a webpage that says no adverse short, long-term health effects have been shown. However, that is not based on a review of the totality of the science. And in fact, there are two separate entities underneath the World Health Organization umbrella. One is the World Health Organization EMF project that drafted these online websites that everyone reads, that we think provides safety assurances. And there are numerous published papers documenting the long-standing industry ties to the writers of these very web pages. And then there's a second entity, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which classified radiofrequency radiation as a possible carcinogen back in 2011. These are two separate entities. Now, the International Agency for Research on Cancer has not convened their expert working group to make another determination based on the newest science, the animal studies and other human studies that have been published. So the WHO EMF project web pages are not official determinations. And actually, to just dive slightly even deeper, if you actually look at the WHO EMF site, you'll see that they haven't made any, done any reports since 1993. You can go to the list where they have their monographs and their reports, and 1993 is the last report on radiofrequency radiation. There's a 2022 letter that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Sage et al. And I'm bringing this up because I have heard statements to the committee that the majority of studies don't find effects. But what this publication, what this letter cites, that in fact the majority of the latest science does show effects. I'll just quote, the 261 studies looking at oxidative effects from radiofrequency radiation exposure, 240, or 91%, showed damage. Of the 346 studies on effects of radiofrequency radiation on genes, 224, 65%, reported genetic damage. Of the 336 studies published on radiofrequency neurological effects, 73% reported effects, and only 27% showed no effect. And there's a Switzerland Institute of the Environment expert review, which was published, that found increased oxidative stress in the majority of animal and cell studies with exposures within regulatory limits. So what federal agency has authority with funding or studying cell tower radiation, making sure that the people and environment are protected? And the answer is none. There actually is no federal agency with any health or environment expertise that is ensuring safety, that's looking at the research, scientifically looking at the levels at which effects have been found in studies, evaluating the studies for their quality, and making a determination. Other countries, not the United States, they monitor the radio frequency levels. Some have real-time 5G monitoring stations. Some have monitors which are near schools or other vulnerable areas as they find. And they are writing in a public way. There's websites where you can look up what is the level here, what is the level there. In France, if you want to know what the level is in your community, you go to your mayor, you request a reading, and you can get that by law. And a lot of countries have it posted on websites. So when it comes to the ambient radiation from cell towers, we have a regulatory gap. And I am glad to answer questions. I guess I would like to end with this one quote from a letter that was published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. And the experts who published this letter, it's about a study that seemed to show safety, but actually the design of it was irrelevant to the way we use technology today and the way we're exposed today. The former director of the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences, Dr. Linda Birnbaum, Hugh Taylor, who's the chief of obstetrics at UNC Hospital, and Dr. Deborah Davis, and Professor Paul Benishai, and neurosurgeon Hillel Baldwin published this letter, which states, the majority of animal and cell studies have found non-ionizing radiofrequency radiation can induce oxidative stress, a key characteristic of human carcinogens, in a way that radiofrequency radiation can initiate or promote tumor development, as well as play a role in the development of other diseases. DNA damage and cancer in state-of-the-art studies signal the need for the public to reduce exposures to radio frequency radiation now. And I'm glad to answer any questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Serrato. Before I go on to that, I did receive a note here, so I will make an announcement. Apparently, some observers have come in here with signs. Signs or placards are not allowed in the committee room. If you would be so kind as to place them outside in the hallway, please, so that they're not in this committee room. I know they're not being shown here, that's fine, but I would prefer that the signs be kept outside of this committee room. If you could make that adjustment now, I would appreciate it. With that being said, does the committee have any questions? Yes, Representative Kelly Pitts.
You only have to put up with me for a few more. Of course, green would be off. How? We're back in session. My question is, why, or do you think that it would be beneficial for the Health and Human Services to join with the science and technology and the municipal and county government to explore getting information out about this subject? I think it's not a one committee, in my mind, it's not a one committee effort. And I do believe that 5G is being deployed as we speak, and we don't know where. The other situation that we have as a committee is that we have given, I don't want to say given up, but we have given up the ability to regulate communications. So it has to be done, in my mind, on a local level. What do you think about those entities joining together?
Well, we have recommended that, oh, sorry, I'm getting feedback, so I have to just not hear the feedback when I speak. My apologies. So we are recommending that agencies with health expertise be involved in a full review of the totality of the science. I mean, right now, the feds, there's no one watching the ball. That's what we have, a situation where everyone's pointing at everyone else, but there isn't an entity doing that. So at the federal level, unless it has not been made public where there's been any full review of this issue. So it would make sense for the health, expert agencies with health expertise to be looking at this issue. There needs to be a full and frank, transparent review of all of the science with the ability for comments, just like you would do in any rulemaking.
Thank you. May I? Of course. And what about the follow-up, since we, as a federal government, perhaps is lagging a little bit? The state government really doesn't have the authority, unless we declare this an emergency, working with the local level, because that's where you can, I believe, control. We were talking about where these things go up, these towers, and the proximity to schools and hospitals. So also working with local, because it seems to me that that's the way it has to proceed here. Have you any other experience with that?
Well, at the local level, it is my understanding that what other communities are doing is having preferences, that there can be priority locations rather than every space is available to companies, but prioritizing where facilities should be, because you can't prohibit service. However, communities can, at the local level, make decisions about where placements should be based on the local, state, and federal law. So, and I am not a lawyer who works in the issue of New Hampshire law. So I can't speak any further than that, but I can say that around the country, communities are having more responsible placement. And I think one thing is that a lot of decision makers, at the very local level, they don't know that. They don't know what other communities are doing. They don't know. They're being told that they can't do anything. In fact, I'm going to quote a decision maker in my community who said, and I quote, they were commanded by the FCC, end quote, to allow cell towers in front of homes in residential areas. And that's really not true. It's really not factual. So I think sussing out what communities can do and empowering communities to do the most that they can to just protect their residential communities and schools and vulnerable areas is something that many experts are advocating.
Thank you.
Any more questions from our subcommittee? Representative Partial.
Yes, thank you for your presentation and for taking my question. I'm looking at the paper that you submitted to us. Oh, and I'm wondering if you could get a copy of your testimony as well. Is that possible?
Yes.
Thank you so much. And I'm seeing a number of small towns, small municipalities actually taking action against the FCC. Do you think that's, well, how can I say this? Is that the most appropriate place to seek action to investigate the situation? Because do the local communities actually have the resources is what my real question is.
I think I'm hearing you correctly. It's a little fuzzy, but you're wondering about local action as an appropriate avenue. And so what are you referring to specifically? Because I think what's happened is local communities are trying to have authority in their community. And so they are filing, are you talking about New York or?
Well, I'm wondering really how these communities that you listed here actually made this change in their local ordinances to make these things possible. Considering that it's a municipality basically questioning the FCC rather than their state. It almost seems like the mouse against the elephant situation. Is it the most effective way to question FCC legislation by having local communities do this, or would it be better on a state level?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think some of the further testifiers are going to address this more deeply. But I will tell you that in our community, in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, the county actually filed a lawsuit against the FCC, saying they were putting the cart before the horse, that they were streamlining in the 2019 and 18 rules and regulations that fast-tracked 5G and small cells into communities without having fully reviewed the 1996 limits. Now, what ended up happening was the FCC made a decision that which was what Environmental Health Trust and other petitioners filed against, saying that, well, we don't have to update our limits. So then the case that the county, these are two separate cases, the case that the county put forward ended up being moot. However, that wasn't based on the merits of the case. It was simply that the FCC had just made its decision. But it really remains a really good question. I mean, how can we fast track these? Local communities are being told in various, information that's being put forward to them that they have to allow cell antennas near homes. And by the way, in Washington, D.C., where the people were not given a voice and there was no transparent process, the setback is 10 feet. Now, how can this be when we have these limits that haven't been fully reviewed? And that's really the question. It comes down to the local communities where people are getting these installations in front of their homes and they're asking the very simple question, is this safe? And how do you know it's safe? And how do I know, this is something that for every other issue, we would have data and documents and a full and transparent review. We would know what we're even exposed to. Whereas in the United States, we don't have federal oversight as we do with many other issues, and certainly not like they're doing in many other countries.
Thank you so much.
I know we have a lawyer also who can answer some of the questions about municipalities as well.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Can you,
Comment for the chair.
a brief,
Yes, I think, could we switch up and have Scott McAuliffe go first? Because I think he'll answer these questions.
okay, yes, I was just going to say, thank you very much for your testimony. I have given a lot of leeway this morning to the first presenter. I would thank you very much for that. But we need, if we can keep our next presentations a little bit shorter, that would be great to allow us time for more questions. So with that being said, I will invite Mr. Scott McAuliffe to go on next to brief, and then after that, I'll turn my attention to a testifier from the other side so we can keep this balanced. Go ahead, Mr. McCullough.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Fine.
Thank you. My name is Scott McCullough. I'm a telecommunications lawyer. Been practicing in this area for almost 40 years now. Over the last couple of years, I've been in the wireless space, more particularly dealing with national standards and also working within municipalities and counties, helping them develop ordinances so that they can maintain the flexibility that Congress gave them while still adhering to the few restrictions that Congress did put in place. I'd like to start out very quickly talking about a couple of other recommendations in the commission report, specifically recommendations 2, 8, and 12. I think these are really important. Nothing in the Communications Act purports, or the FCC rules, purports to restrict what a state or a local jurisdiction itself can say or do by way of education to the citizens. They can conduct studies if they wish. They can make some required disclosures of the wireless industry, although some care is required in that area. They can, to some extent, disclose what the science is, not to some extent, but fully disclose what the science is in this area. They can help citizens that are concerned about exposure find ways to reduce that exposure, acting on their own. Now, let's get to the issue that I think is probably of most interest to many on this committee, and that is, what can local jurisdictions do? The wireless industry, of course, tells all these cities that their hands are completely tied. That is not true. What they have is about 3 strings around 3 of their fingers. They have 7 free. What they cannot do is they cannot discriminate between types of telecommunication services, unreasonably discriminate. They cannot effectively prohibit the provision of service, and they cannot regulate emissions on the basis of the environmental effects of those. But that still leaves lots of flexibility within local jurisdictions. They are still free to exercise regulation that is consistent with their local values, with a concern to property values, and they can make sure that the facilities are put in a place that is safe and does not ruin visual views. They can make sure that the facilities have proper aesthetics, which is the term that is used. So just to give you a couple of examples, a local jurisdiction can, on safe grounds, impose what are called fall zones. If you have a 100-foot tower, you can require that that tower be placed so that if it were to fall, the fall fall zone or the area where it can fall without hurting anything can be, 100% or 125, because typically when these things fall, they create a debris field. So a municipality could say, if you've got a 100-foot tower, you can't have residential or business buildings or streets within 125 feet. Equally important, they can have what are called setbacks. They can impose presumptive setbacks so that, for example, a wireless facility cannot be within 500 or 700 feet, or like the commission recommended, even up to 15 or 1600 feet. Notice I said presumptive. When it comes to setbacks, however, you do need to have what we call a waiver process in place, so that even though the general rule would prohibit placement of a facility in a given location, say they want it 300 feet from a residential area and the setback is 750 feet or 1,500 feet. If there is a waiver process in place so that the wireless carrier can come in and show that unless it gets a permit in this specific location, then it would suffer an effective prohibition of service. The local jurisdiction can impose the level of the burden of proof that is required to rebut the presumption. Many jurisdictions require clear and convincing evidence. In other words, if typically, let's just say you want to have a 750 or 1,600 foot setback from residential areas, that would basically rule out a small cell or a macro in a residential area. But if the wireless carrier can come in and say, I've got to have it right here in this spot in the middle of this residential area, or else I will suffer an effective prohibition. The local jurisdiction can then say, we will give you that waiver if you prove effective prohibition through clear and convincing evidence. That will pass muster under the federal law. Let me give you a couple of examples. Bedford, New Hampshire has a 100% fall zone requirement and a 750 setback requirement for residential. Scarsdale, New York has 500-foot setbacks from residential, daycare facilities, schools, houses of worship, and parklands. Scarsdale also requires that facilities be 1,000 feet apart from each other. So if there is a small cell in one location, somebody else cannot put a small cell within 1,000 feet of that one. Shelburne, Massachusetts has a 1,500-foot setback requirement for residential structures, a 3,000-foot setback from the property lines of schools. Copaci, New York, and I may be mispronouncing that name, they have a 1,500-foot setback requirement, which also includes not only residential, but schools, churches, and public buildings. San Diego County has 1,000-foot setback requirements. And they also have a 300-foot setback for schools, childcare centers, hospitals, religious facilities, fire stations, or sheriff's stations. Malibu has 500, Malibu, California has 500-foot setbacks from schools, playgrounds, and parks, and a presumptive ban on residential areas. Now, again, all of these need to have a waiver process, but they can require a high burden of proof. And a local jurisdiction can do this for many reasons completely independent of health concern. They can say, we don't like these unsightly things in residential areas, no matter how much we dress them up with whatever it looks like, some kind of tree that's in our area. We put them in church-looking buildings. We make it look like a steeple. They're still just ugly. People don't like them nearby. They reduce property values, perhaps. This is a non-health reason. It is perfectly permissible. Another good reason to very much regulate where these devices might be, particularly in residential areas, is if you put one near a corner, say where there is a cul-de-sac, a street that only has one means of entrance. These things are, as Susan Foster is going to tell you a little bit, sometimes they are fire hazards. You need to, as a local jurisdiction, make sure that if one of these were to take fire, then everybody would have a means to escape and go somewhere else around it. In that regard, one other area where local jurisdictions are beginning to implement more regulation, and I would encourage you to put this in any legislation that you have, emphasize that the local jurisdiction can still make sure that these facilities, when constructed, will be compliant with all fire, electrical, and other structural safety codes, whether they be national, state, or local. There are codes that require that these things be designed properly. If they require that a registered professional engineer present a design that shows and says up front, I have looked at this, it will be wired properly, it meets all electrical codes, and it meets all applicable structural safety requirements. Local jurisdictions can do this. They're increasingly do this because, as you are about to find out, many of these facilities, for some reason, seem to take fire. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. McCullough. Very interesting. I will do a chairman's privilege and ask a question first. Just curious, based on the examples that you were giving, other than safety, if there was any legislation that was to come forward involving, say, or pertaining to the examples that you gave, would you say that that legislation would be more appropriate for our Science and Tech Committee, or more appropriate for a committee that handles municipal issues?
I'm not familiar with how your legislature handles its committee assignments, but there are many ways to deal with that. Maybe both committees should weigh in on it, but this does seem to be a science and tech issue. Although, of course, any legislation would have to take into account the way that the state has delegated to your local municipalities how they exercise their zoning. So, maybe a joint call, maybe a joint reference. You do have to make sure when you write any legislation about zoning that you kind of make sure that it works with whatever the existing law is. Because as municipalities are considering these wireless ordinances, what they typically do is they put it into their code, their local code, and they have to make it work within the existing code, even though they are making amendments. They will use similar definitions. They will use similar processes as they do for any other kind of land use permit.
Thank you. Any other questions? Representative Kelly Pitts.
They're gonna be glad to get rid of me. You seem to be talking about new construction. What about add-ons? When they're adding on this particular service to an existing tower, how do you regulate that? Because the tower is already there and they're just adding on the service.
There are two kinds of additions to an existing facility. One is called co-location, where you may have, say, an existing tower with only one wireless provider having equipment there, and a second wireless provider is going to come in, put more equipment, and put more antennas on the tower. That's called co-location. The FCC has established a shot clock period for that. I believe it's 90 days. But otherwise, the municipality is still free to ensure, for example, that it is code compliant. They can make sure that the tower, hopefully, is already aesthetically pleasing. You do find that throughout the country, most local jurisdictions actually encourage co-location. They want people to put their facilities, any new facilities, where there is already a tower. And this is especially so when it comes to macro tower. So, I think actually what you might want to do is encourage local jurisdictions to put, when they are prioritizing where they want new facilities, to prioritize co-location up top, because as you know, it is already there. There is a second kind that I do need to mention. It's what they call an exempt facility. You may have an existing tower and an existing wireless equipment, and the wireless provider that is already there wants to swap out some of the gear or maybe put some new antennas on there. That is a special kind of application for which there is a particular federal piece of legislation and some FCC rules. They're basically must approve. In other words, if they meet the criteria for it being an exempt facility, then the local jurisdiction does not have much choice, so long as, it still meets safety requirements, for example. That's probably, for the most part, a must approve. But once again, this is going in an existing facility. And from a preference purpose, you would probably prefer that they put equipment where there's already facilities and towers than having new towers.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no questions from our committee, I'll
do-
take
you-
questions from other members. Representative Berinsky?
Thank you for taking my question. On the examples, there's quite a wide range of distances for Shelburne, MA. It's 3,000 feet for schools, and then in New York, there's a 500 feet. So with such a wide range, which is the correct distance to place these towers? Thank you.
If you were talking about setbacks, I'm going to support the committee's recommendation of 1,600 feet. That's an appropriate distance. Even small cells can work at that distance. Remember, again, this is a presumptive setback. It is the way that we want them to design and try to configure their networks. If the wireless provider can show that it needs a shorter distance, then there probably does need to be a waiver process for it to come in, meet the appropriate burden of proof, and show that, a shorter separation distance is necessary, or else it is an effective prohibition. But I think the 1,600-foot distance is appropriate.
Thank you.
Okay, last question, and I think you answered this in your discussion, but I'll ask it again. If a community is going to put in a setback, they must provide a reason for that setback, other than health reasons or emission reasons. Did I understand that correctly? Is that they need to prove why they have a setback?
Well, if we are talking about an ordinance or a piece of state legislation that is telling the local jurisdiction what it should put in an ordinance, then yes, I would recommend that there be in the findings, whether it be of the legislation or of the local ordinance, the reason why they are preferring to have these setbacks, fall zones, and separation distances on a presumptive basis. And there are many reasons that are fully lawful under the federal act, including aesthetics, including property values, including other visual effects, and then, of course, electrical, fire, and structural safety. If they invoke these reasons and then I think that it is perfectly permissible. And of course, with the waiver process, we will not have a problem with effective prohibition.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. McCullough. I appreciate it very much and appreciate you keeping it short. That was great. Thank you. I'm going to call on, I think I'm going to go deviate over here and call on is there a Gerald Brushberg, is it? Here? Yes, he's here physically. You're invited to come up and come to the mic and present.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. Thank you, Chair and committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some additional information. I'm a clinical professor of radiology and radiation oncology at the University of California at Davis, and my credentials and experience in this area have been provided to you in a handout. On the very last page, you'll find more detail regarding my experience.
Excuse me, if you could get a little closer to the mic, please, so
bet.
we can all hear you clearly. Thank you.
In the packet that I've given you, I don't want to go over every single point of information here, but I wanted to point out several that I think will be helpful to provide some additional detail to what you've heard already. So if we could first turn, and by the way, I failed to mention that there is a disclaimer on page 2, item 4. Of course, I represent myself, and my views don't necessarily represent the views of my university or other institutions that I have been affiliated or am currently affiliated with. Okay, having said that, if we could turn to slide 19. And this is under the area of, the expert opinions. And it's been said that the FDA doesn't have regulatory authority in this area. And that's true, but it doesn't mean that they have not reviewed the science or opined on its safety of wireless technology. In their latest fact statement, they say, as you can see on slides 19 and 20, that to date, no consistent or credible scientific evidence of health problems is caused by exposure to radio frequency energy emitted by cell phones. And then they go on in the next slide to explain that the gold standard for assessment of risk to the public are largely epidemiological studies. And they say that the currently available epidemiological studies, public health surveillance data, and supportive laboratory studies on cell phone radiation provide abundant evidence to support the FDA's determinations. That's a direct quote, not my interpretation, but their opinion. The next slide, 21, which is very difficult to read, but I can provide you with a more visible copy later if you wish, but it basically represents a whole number of committees that have been put together by countries and agencies around the world that have asked the same question. Is it safe for the public to be exposed to RF energy at the levels at or below the standard? And I think when you review these documents, if you so wish, you'd find that there is a consensus. That doesn't mean that there aren't questions. That doesn't mean that we know everything that we'd like to know or everything that can be known. But based on the evidence as it existed at the time that these various panels reviewed the science, and some of these are very, very recent, the vast majority of them, in fact, all on this list that I could find, are in support of health and safety standards that are very similar to the ones in current use in the United States. If you'll turn to slide 25, it's on page 13. This is a report by IARC, which issues this report periodically. It's referred to as the World Cancer Report, and it details cancer research and recommendations for cancer prevention. They did review both ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. As you can see, this is, 25, page 13. Sorry. And when they got to the study of RF, and this is a very recent report, first of all, RF radiation is not listed by IARC in the World Cancer Report as a carcinogen. It's true that it was listed in an IARC committee report as a possible carcinogen, but this is a more recent and up-to-date statement from IARC, which says that most of the epidemiological evidence does not support an association between mobile phone use and tumor occurrences in the head, which is part of the body, with the highest exposure levels to radio frequency electromagnetic fields. In studies reporting positive associations, it is difficult to exclude various forms of bias, such as recall bias and retrospective exposure assessment. If we can turn to page 20 or to slide 27, again, the National Cancer Institute does not have a regulatory authority in this area, but they care about what does and likely does not cause cancer, and they have had several fact sheets. One in particular that I think is very clear is they've said about the cancer-causing effects of RF energy. That's slide 27, and it says, although there have been some concerns that radio frequency energy from cell phones held close to the head may affect the brain and other tissues, today there's no evidence from studies in cells, animals, or humans that RF radio frequency energy can cause cancer. There was a concern, if you look at the next slide, 28, about long-term effects and children. Fortunately, one of the largest, or the largest study, was recently published in February of this year. It's referred to as the Moby Kids study, and it involved over 2,000 individuals in a number of different countries. I think it was 15 or so. And the conclusion, which I'll just direct your attention to at the bottom right, is that they found no increase of neuroepithelial brain tumors, either in relationship to wireless phone use or the estimated ELF or RF doses. I know that there's been testimony about the NTP study and a lot of concern about what the study said and what it didn't say. NTP itself has tried to provide some color around that issue. And if you look at slide 29, they have an FAQ. This is from the NTP themselves. And they ask the question that is often asked of them, which is, how do RF levels used in the studies compare to typical human exposures? And they make the point that the exposures in the experiments were much, much higher than would be expected from use of cell phones or even, or in particular, cell towers in an environment. And then they ask, do the rat and mouse studies apply to humans? And their answer is, the findings in animals cannot be directly applied to humans for two key reasons. First, the exposure levels and the durations were greater than what people receive. And the second bullet is that rats and mice received RFR across their whole bodies, which is different than the more localized exposures people get from cell phones. Now, to put it more in perspective, I think you would need to compare the levels of exposure that they use to what is allowed by the FCC for whole body exposure. And there, you can see that on the very last line of this slide that the exposures range from somewhere between 18 to 75 times greater than the maximum that is allowed for public exposure. So that is to their point about it not being directly applicable. The next point I wanted to make is about the amount of conflicting data. And I'm sure it's been very frustrating for you to receive what seems like absolute fact on one side and absolute fact on the other side. And the reality is that it's not quite so clear. And research in and of itself is not a precise science like physics, for example. It involves biological studies which have large margins for potential error. And in epidemiological studies, which is the study of disease of populations and the incidence of disease, there are any number of potential problems that can occur in such a study. My professor of epidemiology said to me, I think it was the first day of the class, that the best thing about epidemiology is that it studies the organism of interest, us. And then she said, but then it's downhill in a hurry. And what she meant, and what we spent the rest of the time in our class talking about, were all the kinds of biases that can creep into these studies. And you see some of them there on this list: to recall bias, effects of inaccurate reporting, exposure assessment limitations, insufficient follow-up, inadequate statistical power, and so forth. And then on the next slide, I want to make the point that's been made many times by other scientists, and especially journal editors, is that our current scientific literature is really quite mixed with regard to the quality of the science. These are statements from Nature and from Journal Science and from Forbes, basically saying that maybe half of the studies cannot be replicated. And Richard Horton, who's the editor-in-chief at the time of The Lancet, was quoted in the London Times saying that the case against science is straightforward. Much of the literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. So if you turn to slide 33, it really is the quality of the science that is the center of the controversy, at least in my view. And what you have, if you start at the top there, this is slide 33, you have an assertion of a non-thermal adverse health effect. Of course, that is a very important and sensational item, and so the media covers it with great zest, and it no doubt increases public anxiety. However, the resolution of such a claim requires verification, replication, other studies, which can take years to do. If they fail to confirm the original study, which is often the case, that receives very little or no media attention. And so you have this perpetuation of many false claims that erodes public confidence in our safety standards. Just to give you one example, this is a paper that was published in a peer-reviewed journal that's well thought of. It was a paper by Dr. Martin Paul, who has been cited previously in this committee as one of the champions of explaining the mechanism by which RF energy can adversely affect human health at non-thermal levels. And he goes on to explain in his theory that and specifically regarding the 5G millimeter waves, that the electric fields are almost completely absorbed at the outer 1 millimeter of the body due to their high dielectric constant of biological aqueous phases. However, the magnetic fields are highly penetrating. Well, this, if you turn to slide 37, is a fundamental error of basic physics that most high school physics teachers, if not their students, would be aware. Electromagnetic radiation is a quantum phenomena. It is one of the part of the standard model of elementary particle physics. It's referred to as a photon of energy. And elementary means that it cannot be subdivided any further into its component parts. Insofar as his rationale and the development of his conclusions are based on this really fundamental error that the magnetic fields would continue to penetrate while the electrical fields would not, means that all the conclusions drawn there would be incorrect.
Mr.
Also,
Busherberg,
yes.
sorry to interrupt. We are running a little long on time. Are you almost within a minute of wrapping up? Because I
Yes.
didn't think we were going to go through all these slides here.
Okay.
And we've heard a lot of this technical stuff before, but if you could just wrap it up in the next minute, that would be
Okay,
fine.
well, let me just turn to one thing that I think is maybe more germane to and pertinent to the issues before you. And if you'll look at slide 40, it shows levels of RF exposure that have been set by different countries and organizations. And you can see that that some are 100 times less than what is recommended by the FCC or by the European WHO ICNIRP recommendations. And you say, well, okay, there's a lot of variability here. Why is that? And if I had time, I would explain some of that. But I think the more important point is that when you look at the typical exposures from these types of facilities, and there was a very extensive review of individuals carrying monitors to measure their exposures to almost 250,000 people in 13 different countries across Europe, North America, Asia, and Australia. You can see that the average maximums of exposures were below even the most restrictive of the standards that are recommended by some organizations or countries that believe that the non-thermal is what needs to be protected. And I'll just make one other point and then I'll close, and that is that the vast majority of individuals' exposures that have cell phones come from their cell phone themselves. Maybe this point has been made before, but the point I didn't hear being made was that the amount of RF energy that you, your person standing next to you, gets from a wireless phone is highly dependent on how strong the signal is from the nearest base station. And that can range from its maximum output to more than 1,000 times less than that. And when it's at its farthest output, it's when you have a weak signal, like 1 bar. But when you have good coverage and you have a strong signal, the phone reduces its power to a specific level. That can be 1,000 times less than the maximum that it's capable of under the regulatory guidelines that are produced by the FCC. And so the bottom line is that if you want to reduce the vast majority of public exposure from RF, the place to do it would be by having good coverage, low output from phones, and that would have the largest potential impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bushberg, sorry. Any questions from our committee? Seeing no other questions, thank you very much for your testimony. I appreciate it. I think we're going to do a slight deviation here because I would like to have, I know that Representative Lewicki, thank you, would like to speak on a different idea, and I'd like to save him for last, if you will, so we can wrap it up there. I'd like to call on Susan Foster, if she, okay, Cece, would you like to speak next, please? Go ahead. Next, go ahead. Sorry, if that's okay.
Interrupt anything, but I'm electromagnetic sensitive. So
Microphone, please. We need to hear, and please speak clearly and close to the
Thank you.
microphone.
I don't mean to disrupt the meeting. I'm just, I'm electromagnetic sensitive. And so it's really difficult for me to be in this room right now. My name is Jen White. I live in the Monadnock region of New Hampshire. I gave you my testimony. I'm going to divert a little bit and just speak from the heart. So I developed electromagnetic sensitivity about 12 years ago. I've been a small business owner for about 20 years, and through continued use of wireless technology, I aim a cell phone up to my head for, basically 10 years every single day. Wi-Fi in my home, a smart meter on my home, and also a rad tower that was behind our house. At the time we lived in Connecticut, so behind our house on the Yukon Research Facility property, so in close proximity to our home. So basically with all of that exposure, I developed developed a sensitivity. I didn't ask for this. It happened to me. The gentleman that just spoke earlier talked about, you're hearing two sides. What's the reality? I'm the reality. This is what happens when people are exposed over the long term to RF radiation. I've always been very healthy. I'm 47 years old now. I developed this when I was 35. I had always eaten organic, exercised, did everything right. And, I developed this because I was not given the opportunity to know the evidence of what was happening to me. I found out the hard way. And so I'm here to plead with you to consider HB 1644 on some level. I know that maybe you can't have the registry. I know that maybe you need to call on another committee to be here. But for the sake of people like myself who, really would love to be able to live a normal life, but now I'm unfortunately not able to because this happened to me. And I don't want this to happen to anybody else. This has literally changed my life and not for the good. My husband and I recently went to our 15-year wedding anniversary. We went to an Airbnb in the Lakes region of New Hampshire. We checked into our Airbnb to find out that it's a 5G Wi-Fi home. Within an hour, my body was literally shaking because I couldn't be in that environment. Thankfully, we were able to unplug everything and I was able to coexist and enjoy my anniversary. But these are things that people like me cannot be around. And I'm just one of many, but I'm here to ask you to really consider this because I feel like, I'm one that's speaking up right now, but this is affecting so many people. And it's only a matter of time that this is going to affect everybody in this room. So I'm just asking you to really, really consider this. It would mean so much to people like myself. As I mentioned, this has affected my life. I'm 47 and I'm not able to be in this room right now without my body shaking. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate your concern, and we do recognize that people are having issues for whatever reasons are out there, no doubt about that. We have any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
I'm going to call on, second from last here, Miss Susan Foster, if she's online, I believe.
Yeah. Hi, Pat. I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you not as clearly as the others, and we don't see a picture yet either.
No, there's no picture. I woke up without a voice, so I'm hoping you can hear me.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Morning. My name is Susan Foster. I'm a medical writer and an honorary firefighter with the San Diego Fire Department. I would like to share a cautionary tale with you about the firefighters of California and ask you to do everything in your power to protect all residents of New Hampshire with the most significant setbacks each city and town legally. Fire stations have long been a desired and early target. Of the
I'm sorry to
telecommunications-
interrupt you. I'm sorry. You're coming in a little bit broken up. Is there something you can do? Maybe closer to the mic or something?
Oh, give me a number I can call in, but this is, it is not a good connection. How can you hear?
Yeah. The whole committee is having a hard time understanding like every other word. Is there something here that our IT people can do? You could try that.
Something from. That's okay.
Sure, that's fine.
Yes, I'm just gonna try to put you on speaker and up with our microphone to see if that helps them hear you a little bit better. So just 1 second. Okay, if you could turn off the mic to your computer, just mute yourself and then use your landline. Let's see how this works.
Okay, hopefully you all can hear me.
Are you guys able to get that at all?
Is that a go, Jennifer?
Are you guys able to hear that okay out of your? This gives you a little amplification at your center. Could you just do a test again, Susan?
Okay, all right. Good morning. My name is Susan Foster. Are you able to hear me?
It's clearer. Just speak slowly because we have some machinery going on here, so we want to get
Okay, Jennifer, I couldn't hear Pat. All right, good morning. My name is Susan Foster. I am a medical writer and an honorary firefighter with the San Diego Fire Department. I would like to share a cautionary tale with you about the firefighters of California and ask you to do everything in your power to protect all residents of New Hampshire with the most significant setbacks each city and town can legally obtain. Fire stations have long been desired and an early target of the telecommunications industry. The industry favors fire stations as locations because they are almost always placed near population centers and heavily traveled roadways. The telecom industry wants to reach people in their homes and on the road. Telecom has not had difficulty talking municipalities into granting leases on fire stations because the cities and towns reap the revenue from these leases. Thus, firefighters who often work and sleep at these stations have a substantial 24/7 exposure to cell towers that the industry consistently promises are low energy and 1/1000th of the radiation the FCC allows. Such reassurances ring false when firefighters experience clusters of neurological and immunological illnesses after years of spending shift after shift in stations that are also home to the telecom industry's towers. The stance firefighters have taken in California to keep 5G off their stations should give every American family heightened concern about the cell towers that are creeping into their cities, schools, and neighborhoods, often without local control, without notification, and without environmental review. The firefighters of California have spent 15 years and millions of dollars fighting cell towers on their stations. Let me explain how this started. In 2004, I organized a SPECT brain scan pilot study of firefighters who have been exposed to a cell tower on their station for over 5 years. We found brain abnormalities in all firefighters tested. As a result of these findings, I co-authored Resolution 15, which passed overwhelmingly by the International Association of Firefighters. Resolution 15 urged a moratorium on the placement of cell towers on fire stations in the U.S. and Canada. That was trumped by the Telecommunications Act, but the spirit of the resolution did educate. In 2015, I helped the Los Angeles IAFF locals as they aligned with law enforcement unions to fight FirstNet towers on their stations. I have assisted with a cancer cluster in a fire station in California with a wireless hub next door to their station and a station on the East Coast with a cell tower operating adjacent to the station. I will add that these were cancer clusters in relatively young men with non-presumptive cancers, meaning these were not cancers typically related to the profession of firefighting. Let me tell you a little bit about why the SPECT brain scan study came about. A group of 25 firefighters manned 2 stations. Excuse me just for a moment. Each with a single cell tower. The first towers in town in the late 1990s. There were 3 rotating shifts. Every man worked for 24 hours every other day. In one station, Telecom had placed their tower directly in front of the station.
It was beamed directly across the living quarters of the firefighters to reach 12 lanes of traffic on the other side. The men had been experiencing a range of neurological symptoms since the towers in front of their station had been activated 5 years earlier. All but 2 of the men experienced neurological symptoms while working in these 2 stations. That's 23 out of 25 men. The symptoms the men experienced were identical to what we describe as the constellation of neurological symptoms known as electrosensitivity, or EHS, or more technically electromagnetic sensitivities, EMS, declared by the U.S. Access Board in 2002 to be a disability. EHS or EMS is not in itself a disease, but it is rather a term used to describe multiple neurological and immunological conditions which are a result of the body's inability to tolerate radiofrequency electromagnetic radiation. The symptoms experienced by the firefighters who participated in the SPECT brain scan study were similar to firefighters in other stations who live in the shadow of cell towers. Yet, specific to the men we studied, it is important to note that all the men had passed rigorous physical and cognitive exams prior to being hired by the fire department. Their symptoms included headaches, extreme fatigue, cognitive impairment, anesthesia like sleep where the men woke up for 911 calls as if they had been drugged, inability to sleep, depression, anxiety, unexplained anger, and immune suppression manifest in frequent colds and flu-like symptoms. Real-life examples of these symptoms are best briefly characterized by, first, the firefighters got lost on 911 calls in the town they had grown up in on several occasions. In one instance, 4 firefighters sat in the rig in a stupor with the alarm sounding in the background, unable to remember how to start the engine. A medic with 20 years of experience who had never made a mistake forgot basic CPR in the midst of resuscitating a coronary victim. The brain scans of these 6 men revealed a pervasive hyperexcitability of the neurons in certain parts of the brain. These findings suggest the exposure to RF or microwave radiation was causing the neurons to continually fire in these areas without benefit of rest. When brain cells cannot rest, they ultimately die. The scans further revealed that other sections of the brain that should have been functional showed hypoperfusion or decreased blood flow, suggesting impairment in these particular areas. You have heard and you are going to continue to hear from industry representatives repeatedly that non-thermal levels of RF radiation from cell towers do not cause harm, as they are below the regulatory guidelines offered by the FCC. If you can remember one thing that I tell you this morning, I want you to remember that the tower in front of the station causing the greatest harm to the firefighters measured at 1/1000th of what the FCC allows. 1/1000th. The firefighters' most important lesson to you as state legislators and as a nation may be that if we allow a build-out of cell towers such that they are commonplace in front of homes and schools, as they now are on fire stations, we may be facing a tsunami of neurological symptoms. The forms of neurological damage I worry about the most are cognitive impairment and learning disabilities for children and for adults, early onset dementia, and Alzheimer's disease. The rate of people dying from Alzheimer's disease in the U.S. rose by 55% over a 15-year period, according to relatively new information from the CDC. The direct and indirect costs to the state for Alzheimer's and a host of related neurological and immunological diseases could be catastrophic for New Hampshire and the country as a whole. Clearly, the state of California honored the sacrifice of its firefighters and its concern about the health that they face from cell towers, having granted an exemption to them in AB 57, SB 649 and AB 57, which passed recently, was signed into law by Governor Newsom on October 4th, 2021. These exemptions allow the firefighters to fight the towers without the onerous burden of the shot clock and make it very difficult for telecom to place 5G on their stations. Yet, think about this. Exemptions for firefighters, the strongest of the strong among us, when some residential areas have zero setbacks from residential. If the government of California acknowledges that firefighters cannot do their jobs quickly and efficiently such that the safety of the people and property of firefighters protect may be compromised, what have the legislators been told that the rest of society is not privy to? Firefighters have fought to keep cell towers off their stations because they know they are among the strongest of the strong when it comes to the professionals among us. Yet they have suffered harm living and working in the presence of cell towers. And the firefighters know they cannot carry out their duties to protect the general public as they should if they are indeed impaired. Further, they know that the people they protect, the general public, are almost certainly more vulnerable than they are. Logic tells us that the firefighters, the strongest of the strong, are harmed, and the weakest and most vulnerable among us are at even greater risk. Now, I will quickly address fires. I have worked with Scott McCullough in California for 2 years exploring causes of these horrific fires. We have found in Southern California alone, 4 major wildfires in the last 15 years have started in whole or in part by telecommunications equipment. These initiated fires have cost multiple lives and over $6 billion in damages. I will add one final comment. In the late 1990s, Dr. Bushberg, from whom you just heard, approved the cell towers at the fire stations where we found brain damage in every firefighter we tested. He assured the town council of the safety of the towers that caused brain damage, as proven on SPECT brain scans. And even though cancer is not my area of expertise, I will add that the World Cancer Report that Dr. Bushberg referenced is not a systematic review of the cancer science. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Does the committee have any questions? Before I go on, we're trying to ascertain right now, there is a question as to whether or not, because he also sits on the Science and Tech Committee, Representative Brisney would be on our subcommittee. We're trying to ascertain that right now. So apparently there's a terminology term that we're exploring right now. So shouldn't make that much of a difference in terms of overall work, but we want to make sure that we get it correct. So with that being said, any questions at all on the previous testimony? Thank you so much for your testimony. Very good information there. We're going to move on. We have limited time left, so I'm going to call on Representative Lewicki, who would like to speak on an idea that he'd like to present. And then after that presentation, the committee will go into a brief discussion on what we're going to do.
Mr. Chair, don't forget, CC wanted, maybe give CC Doucette five minutes.
She's already spoken.
Not in this meeting.
That was Jen White. I'm CC.
Oh, I'm sorry. See, excuse me. I got those names confused. In that case, would you speak next, please? I lost track of the names. Briefly, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Cece or Cecilia Doucette. I'm the Director of Massachusetts for Safe Technology. And as Susan Foster just indicated, the gentleman who was here speaking, presumably on behalf of himself, I just checked with him. He is a paid expert from CTIA, the wireless industry. Courtney Gilardi asked that I read you a brief paragraph. She is the mother who was here speaking with her daughter from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where a cell tower was placed by Verizon on top of their neighborhood. And she indicates, Courtney Gilardi and her 14-year-old daughter Amelia could not be here today, although they testified last time as the human evidence of wireless harm. As part of an 18-month investigation into 17-plus people getting sick from a 4G LTE macro tower in a residential neighborhood, the Pittsfield Board of Health met with paid Verizon consultant Professor Swanson. And I will read to you in a moment their investigation of Dr. Swanson. The Board of Health also met with the doctors who treated their injuries due to non-ionizing radiation from the cell tower. The board unanimously concluded the cell tower must cease and desist operations immediately as their homes had been made uninhabitable due to the cell tower. Ms. Gilardi reports neighbors still are sleeping in cars, trailers, and on mattresses on the floor of temporary accommodations just to escape the relentless nausea, headaches, dizziness, insomnia, tinnitus, and other symptoms medically diagnosed and caused by the tower. The Gilardis are not alone. They are asking you for setbacks to protect and prevent harm so that no one in New Hampshire has to suffer by losing their health and their homes the way they did. I would like to read to you from the Pittsfield Board of Health investigation into the cell tower and from the emergency order that they issued to Verizon. Item 21 on page 10. This board has reviewed Professor Swanson's presentation and discussion, because he spoke to their board as well, and finds Professor Swanson's conclusions, several of which are strident and absolute, to lack credibility. A major problem with Professor Swanson is that he speaks as a purported expert about matters of human health and disease and medical and scientific studies about the health effects of exposure to wireless radiation, but he lacks any academic or professional qualifications in this field. Professor Swanson is a professor of theoretical physics. Professor Swanson's research interests focus on esoteric topics in nuclear physics, cosmology, hadronic physics, especially in learning how quarks and gluons build the universe. All 124 of Professor Swanson's published scientific studies are limited to these subject areas. Professor Swanson is not a medical doctor. Professor Swanson has no professional training or qualifications in medicine, medical research, biology, environmental studies, public health, epidemiology, or toxicology, and his professional credentials show no such expertise. Yet Professor Swanson rejects more than 2,000 peer-reviewed scientific studies showing that wireless radiation may or does negatively impact human health, as outliers by fringe scientists who may be conspiracy theorists with an axe to grind and assert that their studies all show confirmation bias. Professor Swanson asserts unequivocally that the scientific consensus is that wireless radiation cannot cause human harm. The board finds that Professor Swanson lacks the qualifications and expertise to make such sweeping statements, and his credibility as a witness is severely undermined hereby. In item 23 on page 11, they continue that Verizon Wireless also submitted to this board documents which consist primarily of self-promotional brochures and industry-funded advocacy pieces rather than peer-reviewed scientific literature. So thank you to the Pittsfield Board of Health for clarifying that the industry brings forward supposed experts who are not qualified to weigh in on this issue. I would like to thank the New Hampshire Commission that investigated the health and environmental impacts of today's wireless technology. They composed a commission of highly qualified experts, and they document the peer-reviewed, non-industry funded science in this document that is in your hands today. So please go back to your own experts who have done their due diligence. But mostly I want to speak about solutions. I am honored to be a co-founder.
I'm sorry, are you into your last minute or so of
Yeah.
summary?
What I
Okay.
want to do is give you an assurance that there are so many resources at your fingertip for education. I have helped to found a nonprofit out of Europe called Wireless Education, where we have literally off-the-shelf courses that could be administered to schools and families in about a half an hour online. For those who want to address the municipal level, Reinventing Wires teaches our towns the many reasons why wireless is no longer the preferred choice for connectivity, fiber to and through the premises. And then for our schools, we have a whole toolkit with tech-safe schools that we can bring to you. You don't have to do this on your own. Even the U.S. Collaborative for High Performance Schools already has a module for new construction and renovation on how to make an EMF safe environment. They're a green school certifying organization. The Hartsbrook School in Massachusetts has already gone hardwired. They put a switch on the wall with a timer. You only use Wi-Fi for the minimum amount of time, and you use hardwired connections throughout the building. And the amazing film, Generation Zapped. We have done screenings in Stratham. We have done screenings in Keene. We can get out and educate at the community level. And again, folks, this is not rocket science. Plug in your technology and turn off the wireless antennas. You will have a much safer connection. You will have a screaming fast signal. It won't drop like wireless signals do. And hardwired solutions consume 10 times less energy than the wireless cloud and all of its distribution centers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentations again. Always a pleasure to see you here. I have I don't have any questions. Does the committee? Oh, by the way, I want to clarify. I guess as the chair of the subcommittee, I have the authority to appoint Representative Brezhnev to be a member of this subcommittee, which is fine. But that's because he is a member of the Science and Tech Committee. I can do that. I cannot do that for members that are not part of the Science and Tech Committee. So that explanation was just given to me. Any questions from our subcommittee members at all? Okay, thank you very much. Oops, yeah, I didn't see it. Good.
Actually, just an opinion. Thank you for taking my question. I'm seeking an opinion from you. I mean, I think the foregone conclusion that you would say is that telecommunications paid consultants on the national level have an advantage over municipalities advancing FCC regulations in favor of the industry.
Yes.
So a follow-up on that would be, we are speaking right now about trying to get municipalities involved, both in educational level and on the zoning level, to increase their voice in where these cell towers are placed. Is that the most effective use of our time and strategy in order to get municipalities involved?
I think, as Representative Abrami mentioned at the opening of this meeting, if you are to take courageous action, two directions would be very helpful to the general public. One, let's get the education out there, because they've only been told by industry that all Wi-Fi all the time is the way to go. And during the pandemic, we handed every student, every child, a wireless device to go home and access their education with not one shred of training, to just say, run the Ethernet cable to the device, go into the device, and turn off all the antennas. Now you can safely access your education. So we desperately need the education to the general public. Secondly, if we do not update our zoning bylaws, town by town, then the industry is going to continue to come in and promote the financial revenue they'll receive from putting technology in at the curb that's radiating your citizens. So I think you need to get the education out there, and I think you need to get zoning bylaws in place that protect within the framework of the existing FCC law, because otherwise, as we're seeing, they are putting these cell towers 10 feet from people's homes. I was in Minneapolis yesterday, and I did a Generation Zap screening there. And there is a woman who has multiple sclerosis. The neighbors were all working from home. They see a truck pull up with a big long pole on it. 20 neighbors went outside and said, "What are we doing?" And they said, "We're installing a 5G small cell antenna." 10 feet from this woman's bedroom. The residents, 20 of them, came out because they're all working from home and said, oh no, we don't want this here. And so the installer called the police. The police came and said, well, actually, with First Amendment rights, they have every right to be out here peaceably gathering. So the police sent the guy away. They've come back now twice, and every time the neighbors get out there to very peacefully protest, and every time a higher level of police has come, the sergeant, the captain, and every time they have protected the citizens' rights to be there. And they have learned that if there are people or cars there, these installers cannot install these because it's a high risk if there are people there. So let that be a word of encouragement to anybody in your community. If you see these coming in, because they are in and they are coming fast and furious before the industry is made to stop. We believe, and as Attorney Scott McCullough believes, you have the power to provide your municipalities with information on how legally today they can start updating their zoning bylaws. Because if you don't have it in your zoning code, you're a sitting duck for industry.
Okay. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to invite, thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to invite Representative Lewicki to give his views on some alternative ideas.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to just give a little bit of background. I have spent most of my life working as an electrical engineer. I first became acquainted with a spectrum analyzer around 55 years ago. And I have heard a lot of talk about the wireless being just a monolithic thing. And one of the things I say is the dose makes the poison. Just for comparative purposes, I counted up, and we have approximately, this is the actual electromagnetic radiation in this room right now. We have approximately 60 fluorescent bulbs. If they're 100 watts each, that's 6,000 watts of power coming from them. Most of it is visible light, some of it is infrared. We have two white things over there on the wall. We climbed up, got the numbers on them. These are wireless transceivers. And they are, from memory, 12 watts each, which is 1/250th of the total power in this room. I also make a habit of visiting tower sites and so forth, and look at the nameplates on the emergency generators. And a large cell phone tower will have a 50 to 100 kilowatt generator attached. So what you've got here is we've got 25 watts, 6,000 watts, and on a big cell phone installation, 50,000 to 100,000 watts. And so we've got orders of magnitude difference. And once again, the dose makes the poison. And the other thing is, don't be stupid. I heard an anecdote of someone where they had a kid in a dorm room and they had one of these things right at close to the head of the bed. Don't be stupid. You don't need to get any more exposure than necessary. But given that dosage differences, the power differences, it makes sense to me to have standards based upon power and possibly on frequencies used, which I have heard no information whatsoever on. We've heard a lot of talk from authorities, and everybody's got their own set of authorities, and the argument from authority is a logical fallacy, which means it's not something that's very convincing. What I would suggest is that we differentiate between the big cell phone towers and smaller ones. If we have a de minimis standard, which might be, and this is pulling numbers out of the hat, it's not anything definitive, but if we say 100 watts and 100 feet of separation from a normally inhabited building would be one standard. And then for the big towers, we could have a much greater standard. And it's not going to satisfy, whatever we do will not satisfy everyone. But if we do have that dual standard, and I don't think we'd ought to try to define the standards in watts per square centimeter or something like that, because that just opens the door to a whole lot of, concern and discussions and haggling. But if, for instance, if we put in the zoning regulations or if we put it in statewide, 100 watts, 100 feet, anything beyond that, a larger standard. And once again, I have still not been convinced by any of the testifiers that this is the right thing or the wrong thing to do. But I think it is something we might be able to legislate and might be something that we can reasonably compromise on until we have additional data. That's all I have.
Any questions for Representative Lewicki?
I have a question for you. When we gave up, and this is, when we gave up control of the telecommunications industry as a state, that we no longer can go to the PUC, how do we legislate that? I believe it has to be on a local level that has to do that, not a state. We gave up that right.
Okay, thank you. As a techie, I'm talking about the technical issues. The legal issues and how it might be implemented are outside of my purview. I found it kind of interesting that we spent the first 45 minutes listening to lawyers, and we've had very little talk on the technical issues. But if we set something, perhaps it would not even be in statute. How we address this, whether it should be in statute, whether it should be by recommendation, and how it would be implemented is outside of my purview. I'm just saying, you know, if we can agree on a dual standard with a de minimis level for things that can be scattered around for at a particular shorter distance, and then you know, have the standard for the higher power levels, and this would end up effectively being you know, a watts per square meter standard, but with just 2 levels allowed.
Representative Berinsky?
Thank you for taking my question. On page 22, slide 44, this is the review RF safety and wireless communication state of New Hampshire. There's a diagram here that shows as the distance grows between the user and the cell tower, the RF output goes to its maximum. And as the distance reduces, the RF output is at its minimum. So can you speak to having these setbacks? Are they counterproductive, or how does it cancel out by having a larger setback? Thank you.
That seems counterintuitive to me. Everything obeys, to some extent, the cube squared law, or you know, the surface of a sphere at a specific distance tells how much the area. Slow down a bit. How many watts per unit of area we might have, and if the power is not at the source, then the power cannot be radiated. That just doesn't make any sense. And so we know that they have directional antennas. We know that the power is not all radiated in a sphere. They obviously try to have the radiated power go to where the users are. However, I don't think that they can repeal something as simple as the cube squared law.
I guess just to confirm, so do you agree with this slide that the farther the user is from the tower, that the more radiation there is? Thank you.
No, I disagree. In certain cases, that will be so. If, for instance, the antenna is not radiating down below, you could conceivably be at the base of the tower and have very little radiation. But if the antenna is broadcasting, you know, one would expect to have it be somewhat cylindrical for something that is a broadcast antenna. As one increases the distance, then the power will go down. Although, you know, conceding that the power at the base of the tower may be very low.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a question from an individual that hasn't spoken yet.
From the tower. So I'm not sure what that means, but there may be a separation between what's emanating from the tower itself, or a difference between the powers and energies being involved. That there's the device that's receiving it and emanating, there's the device that's sending it and emanating, and these are two different factors. And then we're always talking about sort of one set of person in the car with the phone. When you get into a room of people who are all on their cell phones, and there's 7 different signals beaming into every single person's phone, this is also a part of a cumulative effect. And so that would be something to consider, I think, when you're talking about whether the signal would be weaker the farther away or stronger the closer up. So you need to separate which signals we're talking about, and then the cumulative output of all of these devices going all the time.
Make it quick.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. However, we're here today to talk about cell phone towers. What the other effects may be are outside of our purview and outside of my knowledge.
I'd like to just say we don't want to start getting into the weeds here. That was not the purpose of this meeting today. As I said at the beginning of the meeting, we were here to determine whether or not we think there is or is not a way to have further legislation forthcoming or not. I will get to Representative Partial for one last comment before I go to my summary.
This is the very short one. Thank you so much for your testimony. It makes very good sense, and it does get into the weeds. I agree. But your name, for the record. Thank you.
Okay, seeing no further provided testimony, I'm going to go into a deliberation here with our subcommittee members. I will say that we have heard both sides over the course of over a year or 2 years. And I would like to hear from my subcommittee members what their thoughts are on whether or not, for whatever reason, if there should be some type of legislation moving forward, however general or where it's directed may be. We're not here to solve the problem right now. We're here to determine, we either let the subject die by saying there's no further legislation required, or we say that there is some basis for further legislation. We're not quite sure what it might be, but it might cover this area. So I'd like to hear some thoughts from my subcommittee members. You're free to speak. Representative Kelly Pitts, would you like to go first?
Oh, sure, since I think there is a place for further legislation, and I think that further legislation has to do with education, and that was something I was going to work on, and I think it's still necessary. We need to form a resolution, maybe a concurrent resolution, or a bill with a very strong suggestion that information be disseminated to the towns. We get the information, we get all these people coming and talking to us, and that's great, but some of the small towns don't have that, and the counties don't have that. I think all the information, pro and con, needs to be disseminated, and disseminated quickly. I think this should be a bill with priority. We can't mandate that it be done, but we can strongly suggest that it be done. And by done with the companies who are investing in this technology. And I also believe that the companies who are investing in this technology, whether we like it or not, it's going to happen, but we should know where it is and be able to get that information if we have to on a FOIA, on a 91A. We need to know where these towers are going up, where these attachments are going up, and that's the only way we can judge if it's making a difference in what we are doing or seeing. So I believe that that kind of legislation needs to come forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other suggestions? Your final.
My final thought, yes. I mean, I agree with the education part. The other thing is that to come up with a model ordinance for our towns to consider that would cut mustard with the FCC, would not violate the federal law, is something I'm willing to put forward that to help our communities to, like that last story we heard about the whole street came out to protect one woman. There's something, and I know we've heard testimony both ways on the science. I mean, we've heard it both ways, but, and look, I'm not an extremist. You guys know me. But I keep on coming back to the fact that I've heard for a year and a half in the commission that we had a lot of testimony on this stuff. And that's why I brought forth legislation, because there's something here. And I'm not convinced that the federal government is doing its job either. And so I'm saying let's empower, at least empower our communities to have a line of defense if they choose to have one. Leave it up to the communities to make that. But I think the state can help by kind of blessing an ordinance model that would again, because every community does not have the resource to come up with a good ordinance and that would withstand the FCC's, the 1996 Telecommunication Act. So I think that's something that we can do, and I certainly would be working on that, and I would hope that this committee would support that. And as far as the comment earlier about should we get the municipal involved with, there's precedent for that. We had one casino bill years ago when the casino bills were finance and Ways and Means worked together on going through that bill. So there is. That's a matter of talking to the speaker, whoever that may be, as to how to handle such a bill. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Again, so what I'm hearing from our committee is that there is a desire to make a recommendation that some form of legislation should be done on the subject matter. I think it should center around what Representative Kelly Pitts said on education. We don't necessarily have to recommend whether it's a resolution or a bill. We just have to recommend that there is some form of legislation required, and we can make a recommendation on the areas that we would like to see it explored, like education, perhaps. And also the things that would enable communities to pursue their, zoning changes and things like that. Is that the general feeling from the committee, or did I overstate anything?
I don't disagree. Oh, sorry, I don't disagree. We're still in the situation where, I think we really need to talk about the technical issues. And unfortunately, we haven't gotten the kind of information I'd be interested in. There was a professor from UNH, and I said, let's get a spectrum analyzer, drive around and see what we see. And we don't have that information. We could be in a very hot spot here. We could be 100 yards away and be in a very cold spot. And I don't know.
We can certainly add the technical aspects to our recommendation as far as the types of things that some further study might include. I had a conversation yesterday with Chairman Vose, and he was in agreement that we can put in whatever areas of interest that further legislation could cover. Doesn't necessarily have to be specific. It can be general, it can be wide encompassing, just something to give an idea of what type of legislation we might be looking at. So I would agree with that.
Mr. Chair, can I just react to that? So I would support that. The problem when the commission, when we talked about these things, we talked about everything. And that the problem was that doing the measurements around the state would cost money. And knowing our legislature, where's that money coming from? Do we mandate that the industry do measurements? Perhaps. Obviously, they would resist that. But you would think that somebody does measurements, right? And I would say no one does measurements, and so. I would support measurements, but the issue becomes, and then what time of day, where, what direction, there's beam forming, there's all this other stuff that you got to worry about. So, it does get complicated from a science standpoint.
Again, understanding the purpose of this subcommittee is to make a recommendation on whether or not there should be some legislation, whether or not there's a mandate or whether or not there is funds involved would be the subject of whatever bill someone might present later on, which would open up a whole new window of opportunity for testimonies and discussions on that. Representative Donner.
Thank you. In my opinion, I don't think it's necessary for us to make any recommendations because if you've been in the legislature long enough, you know that some bills come back every year. I can give an example, not to go off on a tangent too far, but when I was a freshman legislator in 2011, I spent a long time trying to find when a certain pet was banned, and I couldn't find anything. But one thing I did see over and over and over again was every term there was a bill for hemp. Representative Owen, he put that bill in every term. Some of you might have been here long enough to remember that. And then there's other bills. No matter what the subject is, you can almost guarantee that somebody's going to put in a bill about it. So I don't see this being any different. I'm sure somebody will put in a bill next term for 5G technology and antennas and all that. So it's not necessary for us to vote on anything today.
Well, we do need to vote on something today because Representative Vose is having an executive session on October the 6th, and the recommendations of this committee today will be the subject of the full committee vote, and he has to get a report in before a time period. So that's our function today, is to make a vote on whether we are to go forward or not. I would say, my opinion is that whether we do or don't make a recommendation here, you're right. There will be other bills that will be submitted. I'm positive of that. But the recommendation of this committee could add some credence to whether or not, not in support of those bills per se, but it would add credence to the fact that some legislation still needs to go on because we feel there is something out there. We can't put a cause on it, but we feel that if we say no legislation is required here, my opinion is that it would seem that the committee was saying there is no further discussion required on this subject at all. I'm not quite sure I agree with that. Whereas if we say there is legislation required in general terms, we're acknowledging that something is out there, something may have to get done, and we're saying that we're opening the doors to any other legislation that might come forward that might help with the situation. That's what I feel this recommendation would say on that.
So go ahead.
Go first.
All I was going to say is that I think that it's imperative that we say that we need further legislation and that we need it this term, not study. We need some serious discussion and information to be disseminated about this subject. I was going to ask you, I know I'm a lame duck, but when is the filing period? Is it December?
I think it's November. I don't know the exact date.
November. So,
But Representative,
we
you're
need
never
to rec-
lame.
yeah, I am a lame duck,
No,
but I think we
We
need
value
to.
everything.
I'm a dead duck, but I think we need to recommend that legislation be drafted, and this committee, if they recommend legislation, it has always been the subcommittee that some members of the subcommittee would get together and draw up legislation. And whether, I know it's an election year and nobody, I'm going to be honest because I can now. Nobody wants to do this during an election year because everybody's busy, but I think that it's very important to get OLS and get some ideas down to OLS and get it done. And it's usually the members of the committee where legislation is spawned. And I think we're in that stage.
Yep, thank you. I didn't really understand what prevents a town from setting the setbacks for the towers. I assume that most towns can put in their zoning setbacks for these towers. And then for schools, I mean, I understand most schools can institute the program that was described earlier with having no Wi-Fi or having a timer that turns off the Wi-Fi at certain periods of time. And then for the education, having the state create education materials, I don't know if the state has the resources to do that, and there's already a lot of information. I think if a school district was interested in these things, they can reach out to all these different organizations and learn more and make their own decision on how they want to do things. Thank you.
Again, those are all valid points to discuss if we were discussing an actual bill. I think the purpose of this subcommittee is to just decide whether we want to say we recommend further legislative action, maybe along these general terms. Whether a bill comes out of it or not is immaterial as far as what the purpose of this committee is for. I've heard from everybody here so far on the committee. Representative Parson, you want a final word?
Well, maybe not final, but thank you so much. And I think that I agree with pretty much everything that's been said here right up till now. I'm not sure if towns can actually initiate a setback, but I agree with you. This is conversations best held if we're going to be drafting. And I think we need to say yes to further legislation, especially in terms of empowering our municipalities so they can make these setbacks. They're the most deeply affected and have the fewest tools to really, for self-education, for fair and partial information. And they have less access to FCC than telecommunications industry. My concern is very much lies with the process of how we arrived at this point to begin with. And the voice of our communities really need to be heard in this. And I also think we have a comprehensive study that's already been done. And I think we have, rather than waiting for somebody else to come forward with a bill, we have the momentum, we have invested the time, and I just think we would amplify our efforts by going ahead now to draft legislation.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What I'd like, would the subcommittee perhaps give some idea of whether they would support a dual standard similar to 1644, but with a de minimis level for a very small tower? All right.
That sounds very specific. I'm looking for something general.
Okay.
Let me tell you what my thoughts are. My thoughts are that we recommend to our full committee next week that there should be further legislation, and it should cover areas such as education, technical, and I would also argue that it should cover areas of municipality, something that might get the committee on municipality involved, because a bill could involve an RSA that affects what type of zoning laws communities could or can't do. I don't know. The municipality people might know, but my recommendation would be that we make it in those general terms, that whatever goes forward, we recommend that it should cover education, technical, municipality concerns, or RSAs involving zonings, whatever. Does that kind of answer your question or concern?
Yes.
Okay, with that being said, I would like to call for a motion from the subcommittee that we recommend further legislative action be done covering the subjects of RF radiation, involving education, acknowledging the issues, involving more technical aspects that could involve frequency as well as the power, and that we suggest that a priority be placed on any legislation that might be considered along these lines. And that also the Committee on Municipal and whatever the other words are,
Municipal and county government.
municipal and county government be involved in such further legislation as well.
So moved.
So moved. Do I have a second?
That's the longest motion.
All those, no, you can't vote on that yet. Do I hear a second?
Second.
Second, okay. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
I'm going to oppose because I believe that there's going to be other bills anyway.
So noted. Committee approves 5-1 to recommend to the full committee for next week, which I'm sure will go undergo similar discussion. Thank you very much. I'll declare this subcommittee work session closed to further information I'm sure we'll be hearing on October the 6th. Thank you.